Corporate buyouts usually smell like bleach and fresh ink. This one smelled like sterile alcohol stale coffee and the sudden sharp distress of an Omega. Dominic didn't care about the broken elevator or the peeling wallpaper of the community clinic he had just purchased. He cared about efficiency. Then a 5-year-old boy in a faded Batman shirt tugged his tailored sleeve, pointed to a man collapsed beside a tipped wheelchair, and asked the question that dismantled a decade of carefully built ice. The fluorescent lights in the Southside Rehabilitation Clinic flickered with a rhythmic migraine-inducing hum. Dominic Wright hated fluorescent lights. He hated the cheap linoleum beneath his bespoke Oxfords, and he profoundly hated the nervous, sweating Beta Clinic director trailing a step behind him, rattling off patient turnover statistics. Dominic was 34, the CEO of Wright Medical Logistics, and an alpha who treated his secondary gender like an irrelevant footnote on his medical records. He built his empire on supply chains, profit margins, and a ruthless disregard for sentimentality. Biology was a variable. Capital was an absolute. He had acquired this failing physical therapy center strictly for the real estate beneath it. The building was slated for demolition by October. As you can see, Mr. Wright, our equipment is, well, it's heavily utilized. The director stammered, gesturing vaguely toward a row of parallel bars wrapped in cracked athletic tape. It's a liability. Dominic corrected his voice, a flat baritone that left no room for debate. He checked his watch. I've seen enough. Send the severance packages to HR by Friday. We begin the wind down next week. He turned on his heel to leave. That was when the dull thud echoed down the adjacent corridor. It wasn't a loud noise, but it possessed a heavy, sickening finality. A beat of silence followed thick and suspended before the sharp metallic scrape of aluminum violently hitting linoleum tore through the quiet. Then came the scent. Dominic paused. His jaw clenched instinctively. He spent a fortune on bespoke suppressants to keep his alpha instincts buried under layers of corporate stoicism. But distress, pure unfiltered Omega distress, had a way of bypassing the bloodstream and hitting the brainstem directly. It didn't smell like the cloying synthetic floral garbage peddled in romance films. It smelled like crushed chalk-worn cotton and the bitter metallic tang of absolute humiliation. He didn't want to look. He had a board meeting in 40 minutes. A small tug on his suit jacket anchored him to the spot. Dominic looked down. A boy no older than 5 stood by his knee. The kid was swimming in a faded superhero t-shirt, his messy brown curls framing large, wide eyes that were remarkably dry. There were no tears, only a terrifyingly pragmatic resignation that shouldn't belong on a child's face. The boy pointed a tiny, grubby finger down the hall. "Can you help my papa stand up?" the kid asked. His voice was quiet, steady. "The wheel got stuck again. I'm not big enough." Dominic's gaze followed the boy's finger. 10 yards away, a man was on the floor. His wheelchair lay on its side, one of the front casters visibly bent and jammed against a raised crack in the floor tiles. The man the Omega was frantically, silently trying to right himself. His arms were corded, with lean muscle shaking as he gripped the handrail affixed to the wall, trying to drag his lower half upward. His legs, clad in faded denim, remained motionless, dead weight dragging against the polished floor. The clinic director gasped. "Oh, Mr. Bennett. I'm so sorry, Mr. Wright. He's usually very careful." Dominic held up a hand, silencing the man instantly. He walked forward, his expensive shoes silent against the floor. As he approached, the scent of distress sharpened, becoming almost suffocating in its intensity. The man on the floor, Leo Bennett, apparently froze as Dominic's shadow fell over him. Leo looked up. His face was flushed chest-heaving. Sweat beaded at his temples, plastering damp, sandy blonde hair to his forehead. He had striking eyes, a pale, stormy gray, and right now they were blazing with a volatile mix of panic and fierce, defensive pride. "Don't!" Leo snapped, his voice rough. He let go of the handrail, panting. "I've got it. Just give me a second." He didn't have it. Dominic could see the way Leo's left shoulder was trembling, the joint likely strained from the fall. Dominic didn't offer a platitude. He didn't say, "It's okay," or "Let me help you." He knew the specific, acidic taste of pity, and he knew this man would choke on it. Instead, Dominic looked at the wheelchair. He stepped over Leo's legs, grabbed the frame of the chair, and hoisted it upright with a swift mechanical motion. The bent caster rattled in protest. He locked the brakes. Then Dominic crouched down. He was close enough now to see the dark circles under Leo's eyes, the fraying collar of his flannel shirt. "Your chair's locked," Dominic said, keeping his voice entirely conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. "If you grab the left armrest, I'll take your right side. On 3. Leo stared at him, chest rising and falling. His jaw worked, swallowing the bile of his own helplessness. He glanced past Dominic's shoulder to where his son was standing quietly. "Fine," Leo ground out. Dominic slid his arm under Leo's right shoulder. The physical contact was a jolt. Leo was incredibly warm, his frame dense and heavy. Dominic felt the sharp jut of Leo's collarbone beneath the worn fabric. 1, 2, 3. Dominic stood using his core and legs to take the brunt of the dead weight. Leo grunted in pain, his good arm hauling himself up by the chair's armrest. For a suspended second, they were pressed together, chest to chest. Dominic's breathing hitched. The scent of chalk and cotton bloomed outward, suddenly underscored by the smell of rain-soaked earth. It was intoxicatingly human. Dominic deposited Leo gently into the seat of the chair. Leo immediately shrank back, adjusting his legs with his hands, refusing to make eye contact. He was pulling his walls back up, brick by frantic brick. "Thank you," Leo muttered to his knees. "The front left caster is compromised," Dominic replied, stepping back and straightening his suit jacket. He needed distance. The air felt too thin. "It needs replacing. It will catch again." "I know," Leo said, sharply defensive. "I'm fixing it. Sam, come here." The little boy trotted over, immediately grabbing the handles at the back of his father's chair. "I told him you needed help, Papa." "I know, buddy, thank you." Leo finally looked up at Dominic. The storm in his gray eyes had settled into a weary, cynical calm. "Appreciate the lift, man. Enjoy your tour." Leo didn't wait for a response. He grabbed the push rims of his wheels and maneuvered down the hall, navigating the broken caster with a practiced, frustratingly familiar overcompensation. Dominic watched them go until they turned the corner. "I apologize for that," the director whispered, scurrying to Dominic's side. "Mr. Bennett is a subsidized patient. Spine injury. He struggles with the copays, so we let him use the facility during off hours. But obviously, under the new management—" "Director," Dominic interrupted, his voice dropping an octave colder than before. "Yes, Mr. Wright. If I ever hear you apologize for a patient falling on a hazard your maintenance staff neglected to fix, I will ensure you never work in healthcare administration again. Am I understood?" The director turned the color of ash. Yes, sir." Dominic walked out of the clinic and into the gray afternoon rain. He got into the back of his waiting town car, the plush leather offering no comfort. He rolled down the window, letting the cold, damp air rush in, but it didn't help. His jacket still smelled like rain and chalk dust. Dominic was a man who lived in the metrics. When something didn't make sense, he ran the numbers. When something bothered him, he buried it under pivot tables and quarterly projections. 3 days had passed since the clinic tour. 3 days of hostile takeover shareholder calls and endless cups of black coffee. Yet every time Dominic closed his eyes, he saw a faded Batman shirt and the frantic shaking grip of a man trying to pull his paralyzed body off a dirty linoleum floor. It was an irritation, a glitch in his otherwise flawless operating system. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Thursday. The executive floor of Wright Medical Logistics was tomb silent. Dominic sat behind his expansive glass desk, the glow of his monitors painting his face in harsh blue light. "Greg," Dominic called out. His assistant, a perpetually exhausted beta who practically lived on caffeine, and Spite appeared in the doorway. "You're still here. Tragic. What do you need?" "Pull the patient files for the Southside Clinic, specifically the subsidized roster." Greg sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "Dominic, we're shutting it down. The letters went out on Tuesday. 30 days notice. Why are we looking at ghosts?" "Just pull them." 10 minutes later, a secure file dropped into Dominic's inbox. He opened it, his eyes scanning the rows of names, conditions, and insurance deficits. He found it on page 4. Bennett Leo, age 29, secondary gender Omega, condition T, 12, incomplete paraplegia, sustained 3 years prior. Notes: patient requires bi-weekly intensive physiotherapy to prevent severe muscle atrophy and manage neuromuscular pain. Subsidy granted due to loss of primary employment. Dominic clicked into the extended background file. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for. A justification, perhaps, proof that the world was just as ugly as he knew it to be. Leo Bennett had been an architectural draftsperson. 3 years ago, a drunk driver ran a red light and T-boned Leo's compact sedan. The driver walked away with a concussion. Leo walked away with a shattered spine and a dead mate. The file noted succinctly that Leo's alpha husband had been killed on impact. Dominic leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. An Omega. A single father. A wheelchair user in a city that treated accessibility as an afterthought. Leo Bennett was a statistical anomaly of tragedy. Society was designed to crush people like him. And now Dominic Wright, in his infinite corporate wisdom, had just signed the order to take away the one facility keeping the man's upper body functional. Dominic rubbed the space between his eyebrows, feeling the dull ache of a 12-hour day settle into his jaw. He didn't believe in charity. Charity was a tax write-off. He didn't believe in destiny, or the biological imperative of alphas protecting omegas. That was archaic nonsense peddled to keep the masses docile. But he remembered the kid's eyes. "Can you help my papa stand up?" It wasn't a plea for pity. It was a request for logistics. The kid recognized a mechanical failure and asked the nearest capable body for an assist. There was a ruthless pragmatism to it that Dominic respected. Dominic leaned forward and began typing. "Greg," he called out again. Greg shuffled back in. "Tell me you're ready to go home. Cancel the demolition order for the Southside property." Dominic set his eyes fixed on the screen as he drafted a memo. "Halt the eviction notices." Greg blinked, his exhaustion vanishing in a spike of sheer confusion. "Excuse me, Dominic, the board approved that closure. The land value alone." "I don't care about the land value. We're pivoting. Southside isn't going to be a teardown. We're going to use it as the flagship testing facility for the new automated mobility aids we're developing in the tech division." Greg stared at him. We don't have a timeline for those yet. They're still in R&D. Then accelerate R&D. Dominic snapped, looking up, his alpha command slipping out sharp and heavy in the quiet room. He reined it in immediately, taking a breath. Sorry, look. If we turn it into a subsidized testing and rehabilitation center under our own banner, we get the government tax grants for community outreach, and we keep the existing patient roster as our clinical trial base. It pays for itself in 3 years. Greg narrowed his eyes, studying his boss. He had worked for Dominic for 6 years. He knew when Dominic was lying. You ran a cost-benefit analysis on this in the last 10 minutes. I'm a fast worker. Uh-huh. Does this have anything to do with the fact that you came back from that tour looking like you just kicked a puppy? Go home, Greg. Just send the memo. Greg sighed, turning to leave. You're the boss, but you have to tell the board why you're keeping a money pit open. When the door clicked shut, Dominic looked back at the screen. A small passport-style photo of Leo Bennett stared back at him. Before the accident, he was smiling, his gray eyes crinkling at the corners. He looked bright, untouched. Dominic closed the file. He wasn't doing this for Leo. He was doing it because inefficiency bothered him, and a broken system was the ultimate inefficiency. That was the lie he told himself all the way home. The letter arrived in an envelope thick enough to trigger Leo's immediate anxiety. He sat at his cramped kitchen table, the wheels of his chair wedged tight against the cheap wooden legs to keep him steady as he chopped carrots for Sam's lunch. The apartment was tiny, a first-floor unit that smelled perpetually of mildew, but it had a ramp, and the bathroom door was just wide enough if he scraped his knuckles on the frame every time he went through. Sam was on the living room rug, aggressively mashing 2 plastic dinosaurs together. Leo wiped his hands on a dish towel and picked up the heavy cream-colored envelope. The return address read Wright Medical Logistics, Executive Division. His stomach bottomed out. He had received the clinic closure notice on Tuesday. He knew he was losing his therapy. He had spent the last 2 nights staring at the ceiling, calculating how long it would take for the muscle spasms in his back to become debilitating without the heat therapy and the specialized equipment. 3 months, maybe. Then he wouldn't be able to lift himself into the shower. Maybe this was a bill. A final slap in the face for using their broken equipment. He tore it open. He read the letter once. Then he read it again. His brow furrowed, a deep crease forming between his eyes. Dear Mr. Bennett, please disregard the previous communication regarding the closure of the Southside Rehabilitation Clinic. The facility is undergoing an immediate corporate restructuring and will remain open as a subsidized flagship testing center. As a legacy patient, your care will continue uninterrupted. We request your presence this Friday at 2 p.m. for a patient consultation regarding the facility's new accessibility upgrades. Leo dropped the paper. This was a joke. Corporations didn't just change their minds. They didn't pivot from demolition to accessibility upgrades in 48 hours. Papa, Leo looked down. Sam had abandoned the dinosaurs and was staring at him, his small face scrunched in concern. Children, especially Omega-born children, were painfully empathetic. They read the air like barometers. I'm fine, Sammy. Leo forced a smile, rolling the chair back from the table. Just some weird mail. Come on, let's finish making these carrots before they turn to mush. By Friday afternoon, the rain had returned, turning the city into a miserable gray sludge. Leo's transit van was in the shop with a blown transmission he couldn't afford to fix, which meant he had to take the city bus. By the time he wheeled himself up the cracked ramp of the Southside Clinic, his shoulders were burning, his hands were blistered from the wet push rims, and he was drenched. Sam, tucked under a bright yellow raincoat, trailed beside him, perfectly dry, and clutching a battered coloring book. Daycare had closed due to a plumbing issue, leaving Leo no choice but to bring him along. Leo pushed through the double doors, expecting to find the usual sad, empty lobby. Instead, the place was buzzing. Men and women in crisp suits were taking measurements of the doorways. The broken elevator was cordoned off, and a crew of mechanics was actively dismantling the doors. "Mr. Bennett?" Leo froze. He knew that voice. It was the low, resonant baritone that had echoed in his head entirely too much over the past few days. He turned his chair. Dominic Wright stood near the reception desk. He looked absurdly out of place in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, yet he commanded the space entirely. He wasn't looking at the mechanics or his clipboard-wielding staff. He was looking directly at Leo. Leo felt a sudden, irrational spike of heat in his cheeks. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his skull, smelling of damp wool and bus exhaust. Dominic looked like he stepped out of a magazine. "Mr. Wright," Leo said, his voice guarded. He maneuvered his chair forward, shielding Sam slightly with his wheel. "I got your letter." Dominic stepped closer. His eyes briefly flicked down to Sam, his harsh features softening for a microscopic fraction of a second, before returning to stone. "Thank you for coming. I wanted to speak with you directly." "Why?" Leo demanded, too tired for corporate diplomacy. "I'm just a subsidized patient. I don't pay your bills. Why call me and—" "Because you use the facility," Dominic said smoothly, gesturing down the hall. "My engineers can measure turning radiuses all day, but they don't sit in a chair. I need someone who actually navigates this space to tell me what is broken so we can fix it correctly." Leo stared at him. "You're asking for my architectural opinion?" Dominic raised an eyebrow. "Your file said you were a draftsman. I assumed you'd have an eye for spatial deficits." Leo's grip on his wheels tightened until his knuckles turned white. He hated this. He hated that this billionaire alpha had dug into his past, read his tragedy on a spreadsheet, and was now parading it out. "I don't practice anymore," Leo said coldly. "I didn't ask you to build me a house, Mr. Bennett. I asked you to tell me if the ramp grade in the hallway is compliant." Dominic's tone wasn't pitying. It was entirely business. Transactional. Before Leo could fire back a rejection, a small voice piped up. "You're the lifting guy," Sam said, stepping out from behind Leo's chair, pointing a small finger at Dominic. Dominic stopped. He looked down at the boy. Slowly, deliberately, the CEO crouched down, ruining the crease in his expensive trousers, bringing himself down to eye level with the 5-year-old. "I am," Dominic said quietly. "Are you fixing the wheel?" Sam asked, gesturing to Leo's chair. "I'm fixing the floor so the wheel doesn't get stuck," Dominic replied. Sam seemed to evaluate this answer. He gave a firm single nod. "Okay, that's good." Leo watched the exchange, entirely thrown off balance. Alphas didn't crouch for children. They didn't speak to them with such serious, quiet respect. The fierce defensive anger in Leo's chest wavered, replaced by a terrifying, vulnerable confusion. Dominic stood back up, his eyes locking onto Leo's. "I have an office set up in the back," Dominic said, his voice softening. Just a fraction barely perceptible over the noise of the mechanics. "There is hot coffee, and a towel if you want to dry off before we look at the blueprints. My time is yours, Mr. Bennett." Leo swallowed hard. He looked at the blueprints tucked under Dominic's arm. He looked at his son, who was already marching down the hall, as if he owned the place. "Lead the way, Mr. Wright," Leo said softly. As Dominic turned to walk, matching his pace perfectly to the slow roll of Leo's chair, Leo realized something terrifying. The heavy, oppressive weight of his daily survival, the constant grinding fight against gravity, and the world felt just for a moment an ounce lighter. Dominic's temporary office was a sterile cube of drywall at the back of the clinic, outfitted with a folding table, 2 plastic chairs, and a space heater, fighting a losing battle against the draft. It was aggressively Spartan. Yet the moment Leo rolled through the door, the air felt dense. "Towel," Dominic said. He didn't offer it. He simply pointed to a stack of clean white cotton on the edge of the table. Leo took one. He scrubbed it through his damp hair, shivering as the chill of the rain finally caught up with him. Sam immediately made a beeline for a pristine leather briefcase sitting on the floor. But before Leo could bark a reprimand, Dominic slid a box of brightly colored highlighters across the table. "Here," Dominic told the boy, pulling a blank sheet of printer paper from a tray. "Architecture requires color coding. Let me see what you can draft." Sam's eyes widened. He grabbed a neon pink marker plopped onto the floor and got to work. Leo watched the interaction with a tight chest. "You don't have to humor him." "I don't humor anyone, Mr. Bennett. It's a waste of time. He needed a task." Dominic unrolled a massive sheet of blueprint paper across the table, weighing the corners down with a stapler, a tape dispenser, and 2 coffee mugs. "Coffee is black. Sugar is in the packets. Now, look at the corridor expansion." Leo wheeled closer, locking his brakes. He leaned over the table, the familiar blue ink and grid lines hitting him with a wave of sharp, unexpected nostalgia. He used to live in these lines. He used to build worlds inside them. He traced a finger over the schematic for the new physical therapy wing. "Your turning radiuses are ADA compliant," Leo murmured, his eyes scanning the measurements. 60 inches. That's the legal minimum." "But," Dominic prompted. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching Leo intently. "But the legal minimum is written by people who walk." Leo tapped a sharp intersection on the paper. "You have a 90-degree turn immediately exiting the hydrotherapy room. If someone is using a bariatric chair or an extended power chair, they are going to scrape the drywall every single time. And the door swings inward. If a patient falls inside that room and blocks the door, your staff can't get in to help them." Dominic didn't argue. He didn't get defensive about his engineer's work. He simply picked up a red pen, leaned over the table, and handed it to Leo. Their fingers brushed. Dominic's skin was warm, calloused at the edges from years of gripping squash rackets and steering wheels. Leo's hands were rougher, scarred from push rims and pavement. The brief point of contact sent a localized jolt up Leo's arm. He ignored it, snatching the pen. "Redraw it," Dominic commanded softly. For the next 2 hours, the only sounds in the room were the scratching of the red pen, the squeak of Sam's highlighters, and the low, steady hum of the space heater. Leo forgot he was talking to a billionaire alpha. He forgot about the worn elbows of his flannel shirt and the persistent dull ache in his lower lumbar spine. He fell into the rhythm of the work, crossing out inadequate ramp grades, adjusting the heights of grab bars, and redesigning the reception desk to have a lowered counter section that wouldn't force wheelchair users to shout over a barrier. Dominic asked questions. Sharp, incisive questions. He absorbed Leo's answers like a machine processing raw data, nodding and making shorthand notes on a legal pad. "You're very good at this," Dominic observed, breaking a long silence. Leo paused. He stared at the red ink bleeding into the paper. "I was, before the accident." Leo bristled, his shoulders tensing. "You read my file. Don't pretend you don't know. I know the metrics of your injury. I don't know you." Dominic stepped away from the wall, pulling out the plastic chair opposite Leo and sitting down. The file says you were a junior partner at a firm downtown. Why didn't you go back? Drafting is a desk job. Leo let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Right, a desk job. Have you ever tried navigating a construction site in a wheelchair? Mr. Wright, have you ever tried doing a site visit when the only access is a mud slope and temporary stairs? My firm didn't want the liability. They offered me a severance and a nice card. My husband died in the crash, my medical bills ate the insurance payout, and I had a 2-year-old. He slammed the red pen down onto the table. The sudden noise made Sam jump, looking up from his drawing. Leo instantly regretted it. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Sorry, You don't need my life story. The blueprints are fixed. Send them to your contractors. He reached down to unlock his brakes. I need a project manager for this site. Leo froze. He looked up. Dominic was staring at him, his face an unreadable mask of corporate composure, but his scent usually buried under layers of expensive cologne and suppressants, spiked with a sudden sharp edge of ozone, the smell of an approaching storm. Excuse me, Leo whispered. I fired the clinic director this morning. He was incompetent, Dominic stated, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table. I need someone on the ground here to oversee the renovations. 3 days a week. Contract work. You know the facility. You know the ADA loopholes, and you clearly have a lower tolerance for bullshit than my engineering team. I'm an Omega on disability. I haven't worked in 3 years. I don't care if you're a purple alien who hasn't worked in a decade. Can you do the job? Leo stared at the alpha. It wasn't charity. Dominic Wright's eyes were too cold, too calculating for charity. He was looking at Leo like a resource, an asset. For the first time in 36 months, someone was looking at Leo Bennett and seeing something other than a tragedy. Yes, Leo swallowed hard. I can do the job. Good. Greg will email you the contract by 6. Compensation will be commensurate with your previous firm's salary. Dominic stood up. Keep the pen. I'll see you on Monday, Mr. Bennett. 3 weeks later, the Southside Rehabilitation Clinic was a skeleton of exposed beams and drywall dust. Leo thrived in the chaos. He had a hard hat hanging off the back of his chair and a clipboard permanently welded to his hand. The contractors, initially skeptical of taking orders from a wheelchair-bound Omega, quickly learned that Leo possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of building codes and a terrifyingly sharp tongue when corners were cut. Dominic visited the site twice a week. He never announced his arrivals. He would just appear a dark, tailored specter amidst the sawdust and neon safety vests. He would stand beside Leo, reviewing progress, their shoulders inches apart. Leo found himself looking for Dominic. He hated it. He hated the way his pulse jumped when he caught the scent of ozone and expensive coffee. He was a widower, a crippled Omega with a kid. He had no business harboring a low-level biological hum for a billionaire alpha who was technically his boss. It came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The weather had snapped, plummeting into a bitter, damp cold that seeped into the concrete foundations of the clinic. The drop in barometric pressure was hell on spinal injuries. Leo had been pushing himself too hard. He knew it. But the framing for the new therapy pool was going up, and he refused to leave until the measurements were verified. By 4 p.m., the muscle spasms started. They began as a dull ache in his lower back, quickly escalating into violent, involuntary tremors shooting down his paralyzed legs. His muscles, disconnected from his brain's regulatory signals, were misfiring in a panic. He wheeled himself into the unfinished hydrotherapy room to hide. He locked his brakes, gritted his teeth, and gripped the armrests of his chair as a particularly vicious spasm forced his legs to jerk straight out his feet, kicking the metal foot plates with a loud clang. He was sweating, his vision blurred at the edges. Spasticity this bad usually required a muscle relaxant he didn't have on him, and 30 minutes of deep tissue massage to trick the nervous system into standing down. "Breathe, Leo," he hissed to himself, pressing the heel of his hand hard into his thigh, trying to force the muscle to release. It didn't work. His right leg violently jerked again, threatening to throw his balance off entirely. "Leo." The voice was a low, commanding rumble. Leo snapped his head up. Dominic was standing in the doorway, his custom suit dusting with drywall powder. His jaw was clenched tight. "Go away!" Leo gasped out, his pride flaring wildly. He tried to push his chair backward to hide in the shadows of the unfinished room, but his hands were shaking too badly to grip the rims. Dominic didn't go away. He stepped into the room and closed the heavy unfinished wooden door behind him, cutting off the noise of the construction crew outside. "You're in pain. Your scent is flooding the hallway." Dominic's voice was tight restrained. Leo flushed with profound humiliation. And Omega's distress scent was a biological beacon, an involuntary broadcast of vulnerability. "I'm fine. It's just a spasm. The cold weather." He cut off with a sharp groan as his lower back seized up his torso, pitching forward. Dominic crossed the room in 2 massive strides. He crouched beside Leo's chair, heedless of the concrete floor ruining his trousers. "What do you need?" Dominic asked. No pity, just a demand for data. "I need," Leo panted, his forehead resting against his own knees, "pressure. Deep pressure on the quads. It overrides the nerve misfires, but I can't get enough leverage." "Show me." Leo looked up, his gray eyes wide and glassy with pain. Dominic's expression was deadly serious. The Alpha's scent had shifted. The storm had broken, rolling over Leo in a heavy grounding wave of wet earth and ozone. It was instinctively designed to calm a panicking Omega, and to Leo's absolute horror, it was working. His heart rate began to slow. "Above the knee," Leo managed to say, pointing a shaking finger. "You have to press down hard." Dominic shifted his weight. He placed his large, warm hands on Leo's thighs, just above the knees. He didn't hesitate. He didn't treat Leo like he was made of glass. He applied a firm, heavy downward pressure, using his upper body strength to force the misfiring muscles into submission. Leo let out a ragged breath, his head dropping back. The relief was instantaneous, a painful burning release of tension. They stayed like that for 5 minutes. The only sound was Leo's ragged breathing and the distant hum of power tools. Dominic didn't move. His hands were a heavy, solid anchor in a body that felt entirely out of Leo's control. "Better?" Dominic asked softly, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "Yes," Leo whispered, his eyes still closed. "Thank you." Dominic slowly released the pressure, pulling his hands back. But he didn't stand up. He stayed crouched next to the chair, looking up at Leo. "You push yourself too hard," Dominic said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "I have to," Leo replied, opening his eyes, meeting the Alpha's intense stare. "The world doesn't stop because I can't walk, Dominic. If I don't push, I get run over." It was the first time Leo had used his first name. Dominic's eyes darkened slightly. He reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing the armrest of Leo's chair a millimeter away from Leo's hand. "You don't have to push here," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on Leo's arm stand up. "Not in this building. I'll make sure of it." Before Leo could untangle the terrifying implications of that promise, Dominic stood up, smoothing his tie, the corporate armor slamming back into place. "Your van is still in the shop," Dominic said briskly. "I had Greg look into it. The transmission needs a full rebuild. I'm driving you and Sam home today." "You don't have to. I'm driving you home, Leo. That wasn't a request." The rain was relentless, sheeting against the tinted windows of Dominic's Mercedes SUV. Sam was asleep in the back seat, his head resting against his booster seat, exhausted from an afternoon spent coloring in the site manager's trailer. Leo sat in the passenger seat, hyper-aware of the heated leather, the silent engine, and the heavy presence of the man driving. His wheelchair was folded and stowed in the cavernous trunk. "Take the next left," Leo said quietly, pointing to a narrow, poorly lit street lined with crumbling brick apartment buildings. Dominic signaled and turned the heavy vehicle. The contrast between the luxury car and the neighborhood was stark, a screaming neon sign of economic disparity. "Number 42. The one with the green door," Leo instructed. Dominic pulled up to the curb. He put the car in park but left the engine running, the headlights cutting through the driving rain to illuminate a cracked concrete ramp leading up to a peeling front door. Leo stared out the window. He felt the sudden crushing weight of reality settling back over him. At the clinic, he was a project manager. He was an equal. Here, he was a disabled single father living in a subsidized box that smelled like wet dog and desperation. He didn't want Dominic to see it. "Thank you for the ride," Leo said, his voice stiff. He unbuckled his seatbelt. "I can get my chair out. Just pop the trunk." "Sit still," Dominic commanded, already opening his door and stepping out into the downpour. Leo watched in a mix of frustration and awe as Dominic Wright, CEO, wearing a $3,000 suit, marched to the back of the SUV, pulled out the heavy wheelchair, and unfolded it on the wet sidewalk with a loud clack. Dominic opened the passenger door. The cold air rushed in. "I can transfer myself," Leo snapped, his pride rearing its ugly head again. "I know you can," Dominic said, water dripping from his dark hair. He stood back, giving Leo the space to maneuver. Leo grabbed the roof handle, shifting his weight, dragging his paralyzed legs across the seat and dropping expertly into his chair. He locked the brakes and reached into the back seat to unbuckle Sam. Dominic beat him to it. He reached in, scooped the sleeping boy up with practiced ease, and tucked Sam's small head under his own suit jacket to shield him from the rain. "Lead the way," Dominic said over the sound of the storm. Leo swallowed his protests and pushed himself up the cracked concrete ramp. He unlocked the green door and pushed inside, flipping the light switch. The apartment was exactly as depressing as Leo knew it was. The beige carpet was stained. The furniture was second-hand and sagging. Toys were scattered across the floor, and a pile of final notice medical bills sat prominently on the tiny kitchen counter. Dominic didn't look around. He didn't flinch at the smell of mildew. He carried Sam into the bedroom, Leo pointed out gently, laying the boy down on the twin bed and pulling the covers up. When Dominic emerged into the tiny living room, he was soaked. His suit jacket was ruined, clinging to his broad shoulders. "I'll get you a towel," Leo muttered, wheeling toward the bathroom. "I'm fine." Dominic stopped him, putting a hand on the back of Leo's chair. Leo froze. He turned his chair around in the tight space. They were very close. The apartment was too small for an alpha of Dominic's size. His presence filled the room, eating up the oxygen, making it impossible for Leo to think clearly. "Why are you doing this?" Leo asked, his voice shaking slightly. The exhaustion of the day, the pain, the sheer vulnerability of having this man in his home was tearing his carefully built defenses apart. Dominic looked down at him. The cold, calculating CEO was gone. In his place was something raw, something heavy and intensely focused. "Doing what?" Dominic asked softly. "This. Driving me home. Fixing my clinic. Paying me. Don't—" Leo held up a hand as Dominic opened his mouth. "Don't tell me it's about efficiency. Don't tell me it's a tax write-off. I'm not an idiot, Dominic. You're an alpha who buys and sells hospitals for sport. People like you don't look twice at people like me unless there's a punchline." Dominic stepped closer. His knee brushed the side of Leo's wheel. "I am not laughing, Leo." Leo looked up, his breath hitching. The storm in Dominic's eyes was terrifyingly gentle. "You're a widower," Dominic stated quietly, the truth hanging in the space between them. "You built a fortress around yourself and your son because the world failed you. It failed to protect you, and it failed to accommodate you." Dominic crouched down again. It was a deliberate, submissive posture, completely counterintuitive to everything an alpha was taught to be. He looked up into Leo's stormy gray eyes. "I fix broken systems," Dominic continued, his voice barely a whisper. "That is what I do. But when I looked at you on that floor 4 weeks ago, I realized I didn't want to fix the building for the tax credit. I wanted to fix it, so you never had to look at me like that again." Leo's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white. "Like what?" "Like you expected me to step over you." Dominic reached out his large hand, gently covering Leo's shaking, scarred fingers. "I will never step over you, Leo." Leo felt a tear, hot and sharp, spill over his eyelashes. He had spent 3 years carrying the weight of his own shattered life, convincing himself that he was a burden, a tragedy. He wasn't supposed to be seen as an equal. He wasn't supposed to be desired. "I don't need a savior, Dominic," Leo choked out, his voice cracking. "I can't survive another broken heart. I won't survive it." Dominic's grip on his hand tightened, anchoring him. "I am not a savior," Dominic said, his thumb brushing over the scar tissue on Leo's knuckles. "I'm a logistics man. And logically, Leo Bennett, I have absolutely no idea how to operate without you anymore." The morning after Dominic Wright knelt on a stained beige carpet, Leo expected the world to snap back to its harsh, cynical default. He expected the billionaire to wake up, realize the messy, logistical nightmare of courting a paralyzed Omega with a 5-year-old, and quietly retreat behind a wall of corporate secretaries. That was how the world worked. People liked the idea of fixing a broken thing, but they rarely liked the reality of the glue on their hands. But Dominic didn't retreat. He advanced. And he did it with the same terrifying systematic precision he applied to a corporate merger. 3 days later, Leo wheeled out the front door of his apartment building, bracing himself for the 2-block push to the bus stop in the freezing November wind. He froze at the bottom of the ramp. His blue transit van was parked at the curb. It wasn't a new car. Dominic hadn't pulled a grotesque billionaire power play and bought him a $60,000 luxury vehicle with a bow on top. That would have made Leo sick with obligation. It was his exact same rusty 10-year-old van. But the suspension wasn't sagging. The tires were new. And when Leo unlocked it with his fob, the engine turned over with a smooth, quiet purr that hadn't existed since 2022. A note was taped to the steering wheel. Crisp, heavy cardstock. The transmission was a hazard. I had the mechanics replace the belts while they were in there. Do not argue with me about the invoice. I expensed it to the clinic's transportation budget. Have a good morning. D. Leo stared at the note. His chest tightened, a familiar defensive panic, warring with something deeply, profoundly warm. He gripped the steering wheel, resting his forehead against the cold leather. He didn't know how to fight this. Dominic wasn't fighting his pride. He was aggressively accommodating it. The dynamic at the construction site shifted. It was subtle to the contractors, but deafening to Leo. Dominic still showed up, unannounced, still smelled like sharp ozone and espresso, but the distance between them had evaporated. If Leo was reviewing blueprints at the folding table, Dominic stood behind him, his hand resting casually on the back of Leo's chair. A silent, constant anchor. When the temperature dropped, Dominic brought a heavy wool blanket from his car and draped it over Leo's lap without a word, knowing Leo couldn't feel the cold setting into his lower legs until the muscle spasms started. "You're hovering," Leo muttered one afternoon, snapping a clipboard shut as Dominic adjusted the space heater closer to his desk. "I am optimizing the temperature of my project manager," Dominic replied evenly, not looking up from his phone. "Cold joints reduce productivity. I am a grown man, Dominic. I survived 3 winters before you showed up." Dominic finally looked at him. The Alpha's dark eyes locked onto Leo, stripping away the noise of the construction site. "Surviving isn't living, Leo. You've been holding your breath for 36 months. I'm just trying to give you enough air to exhale." Leo swallowed hard, his throat tight. He looked down at his scarred hands, tracing the calluses on his palms. "It scares me." He admitted, the words barely audible over the hum of the space heater. "When people make things easy for me, I'm always waiting for the bill. There is always a bill." Dominic stepped closer. He knelt just as he had in the apartment, ignoring the drywall dust on the concrete floor. He took Leo's hand, his thumb brushing over the rough skin. "I have enough money, Leo," Dominic said quietly. "I don't need your debt. I want your time." "I come with a lot of baggage," Leo whispered, his gray eyes searching the Alpha's face for the catch. "My legs aren't going to wake up. There's no medical miracle at the end of this project. It's catheters and physical therapy and days where I can't get out of bed because the nerve pain feels like battery acid. This isn't a romance novel. It's ugly. I deal in logistics, not miracles." Dominic answered his voice, a low, steady rumble that vibrated right into Leo's chest. "I know exactly what the mechanics of your life entail. I read the medical reports. I read the architectural specs of your apartment. I know the ugly parts." Dominic leaned in his lips, brushing the inside of Leo's wrist right over his pulse point. The scent of ozone and rain spiked thick and intoxicating. "I am not afraid of your gravity, Leo. Let me help you carry it." By early December, the Southside Rehabilitation Clinic was finished. It was a masterpiece of accessible design. The hallways were wide, the lighting was diffused to prevent migraines, and the physical therapy equipment was state-of-the-art. Dominic had spared absolutely no expense. The grand opening was a necessary evil. Right medical logistics needed the positive PR, which meant the clinic was crawling with local politicians, reporters, and the wolves of Dominic's executive board. Leo hated it. He sat in his chair near the reception desk wearing a tailored navy suit that he hadn't put on since before his husband's funeral. It still fit his shoulders, but the fabric pooled slightly around his atrophied legs. He felt exposed. He was a piece of the architecture put on display for men in bespoke Italian wool to pat themselves on the back. Dominic was across the room, surrounded by a swarm of city council members. He looked lethal in a charcoal 3-piece suit, commanding the room with effortless, terrifying alpha magnetism. But every few minutes his eyes would cut through the crowd, finding Leo checking in. A silent tether pulling taut across the crowded room. "Marvelous facility, isn't it?" Leo turned his head. A tall, graying alpha with a predatory smile and a champagne flute had sidled up next to his chair. Leo recognized him from the corporate dossier Dominic kept. Richard Harrison, board member. Vulture. "It's functional," Leo said coldly. "Functional, yes." Harrison chuckled, sipping his champagne. He looked down at Leo, his eyes sweeping over the wheelchair, with a thinly veiled glaze of pity. Dominic always did have a flair for the dramatic. Buying a doomed clinic, keeping the subsidized patients. His brilliant optics. The tax write-offs alone are astronomical. And parading you out. Having a legacy patient run the project, the media is eating it up. Leo's jaw clenched. The old familiar shame flared in his chest, hot and acidic. He gripped his push rims, ready to roll away. He was just a prop, a feel-good story for the quarterly report. It's a very clever use of a tragedy. Harrison added, his tone conversational. He's not a tragedy, Richard. He's the architect who caught the six-figure structural flaw your hand-picked engineering firm missed. The voice sliced through the noise of the lobby like a scalpel. Harrison flinched, turning around. Dominic stood a few feet away. The city council members were gone. The CEO's face was a mask of absolute glacial fury. The scent rolling off Dominic was so aggressively dominant, so thick with alpha wrath, that a nearby beta waiter actually stumbled. "Dominic!" Harrison forced a laugh, taking a step back. "I was just making conversation with Mr. Bennett." "You were making assumptions." Dominic stepped closer, placing a heavy possessive hand on the back of Leo's chair. The contact sent a shock wave of grounding heat straight down Leo's spine. "Let me clarify the optics for you. Mr. Bennett didn't just project manage this facility. He redesigned the hydrotherapy wing. He corrected the ADA compliance failures your nephew's firm drafted. He saved this company $400,000 in potential retrofitting lawsuits." Harrison's smile vanished. He looked at Leo, really looked at him for the first time. "If I ever hear you speak to my lead of accessible infrastructure with that tone again," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a register that made the champagne tremble in Harrison's glass, "I will personally see to it that you are voted off the board by Friday. Enjoy the catering." Harrison swallowed hard, gave a stiff nod, and practically sprinted toward the other side of the room. Dominic didn't watch him go. He stepped around to the front of Leo's chair. The terrifying alpha aura instantly vanished, replaced by a quiet, focused concern. "Are you all right?" Dominic asked quietly. Leo stared at him. The heat in his chest wasn't shame anymore. It was something entirely different. It was a fierce, burning pride. Dominic had defended him by coddling him or playing the protective alpha card. He had defended him by weaponizing Leo's own competence. He had handed Leo his dignity on a silver platter. Lead of accessible infrastructure. Leo arched an eyebrow, a small, genuine smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "That's a new title. Does it come with a parking spot?" Dominic's shoulders dropped, a heavy sigh of relief escaping him. He reached out his knuckles, briefly brushing the lapel of Leo's suit. "It comes with an office on the executive floor, if you want it." Leo looked around the clinic. He looked at the wide doors, the flawless ramp grades, the hydrotherapy pool he had drawn with a red pen on a folding table. He had built this. He had taken his broken world and forced it to make sense. He looked back at Dominic. "I'll need a corner office," Leo said softly. "The turning radius in the standard cubicles is abysmal." Dominic smiled. It was a rare, devastating thing that transformed his harsh features into something entirely beautiful. Done. The clinic opening wrapped up by 9. Sam was spending the night at a friend's house, a rare quiet luxury that left Leo alone in his apartment. Only he didn't go to his apartment. Dominic's town car pulled into the underground garage of a sleek high-rise building downtown, the penthouse level. Leo sat in the passenger seat, his heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He had never been to Dominic's home. The wealth of it was intimidating. The idea of navigating a billionaire's pristine glass and marble fortress in a wheelchair was terrifying. He pictured thick, impossible carpets, narrow designer doorways, steps leading into sunken living rooms. Dominic unloaded the chair in silence. Leo transferred himself, his movements slightly stiff with anxiety. They rode the private elevator up in silence. When the doors slid open, stepping directly into the penthouse, Leo braced himself for the physical barriers. He stopped. The apartment was massive, bathed in the soft glow of the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. But that wasn't what made Leo's breath catch. There were no thick rugs. The flooring was smooth, polished hardwood, offering zero friction to his wheels. The doorway to the kitchen had been visibly widened, the fresh paint on the door frame barely dry. There was no sunken living room. Dominic walked to the kitchen island and set his keys down. He didn't look at Leo. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, his movements methodical. "You changed the floors," Leo whispered, pushing himself slowly into the massive living space. The wheels glided effortlessly. The previous carpet had a pile depth of 3/4 of an inch, Dominic said, rolling up his sleeves. "It would have required too much upper body exertion for you to navigate comfortably. I had the contractors replace it while we were finishing the clinic." Leo wheeled closer to the kitchen. He noticed the slight incline of a custom-built, seamlessly integrated ramp leading out to the terrace. He noticed the height of the coffee table. Dominic hadn't just brought him here. Dominic had dismantled his own home and rebuilt it so Leo wouldn't have to fight for a single inch of space. "Dominic!" Leo's voice broke. He locked his brakes in the center of the room. The sheer weight of the gesture was staggering. It wasn't a bouquet of roses. It wasn't a romantic dinner. It was a man altering the physical infrastructure of his life to make room for a broken Omega. Dominic turned around. He leaned against the marble counter, his dark eyes heavy with an emotion so intense it made the air in the room feel dense. "I told you," Dominic said quietly. "I fix broken systems." Leo unlocked his brakes. He pushed himself across the hardwood, stopping mere inches from where Dominic stood. He looked up at the Alpha. The scent of ozone and rain was overwhelming, entirely enveloping Leo's own scent of chalk and cotton until they were impossible to separate. "I'm not a system." Leo breathed his hands, leaving the push rims resting nervously on his own thighs. Dominic stepped into the narrow space between Leo's footplates. He reached down his large warm hands, gently cupping Leo's face. His thumbs brushed over Leo's cheekbones, wiping away a stray tear that Leo hadn't realized had fallen. "No," Dominic murmured, his voice dropping to a rough, gravelly whisper. "You're everything else." Dominic leaned down. The kiss wasn't hesitant. It was a collision. Dominic's mouth captured Leo's with a desperate, heavy hunger, the culmination of 2 months of terrifying restraint. Leo gasped, his hands instinctively flying up, gripping the lapels of Dominic's expensive shirt, pulling the Alpha closer. Dominic groaned a deep guttural sound that vibrated right through Leo's chest. He shifted his weight, his hand sliding down to grip Leo's shoulders, grounding him, anchoring him in the chair as the kiss deepened. It was a promise signed in breath and teeth. There was no pity here. There was only absolute consuming desire. Leo kissed him back with a fierce, reckless abandon. He tasted like espresso, and the sharp, clean edge of the winter wind. For 3 years, Leo had felt entirely disconnected from his own body, viewing it only as a heavy, broken machine he had to drag through life. But right now, under Dominic's heavy, reverent hands, he felt electric. He felt alive. Dominic pulled back slightly, both of them breathing heavily. He rested his forehead against Leo's, his eyes closed. "Move in with me," Dominic whispered into the quiet room. Leo let out a wet, shaky laugh, his hand still gripping Dominic's shirt. "I have a 5-year-old and a lot of very ugly medical equipment." "I have 3 spare bedrooms and a freight elevator," Dominic replied without missing a beat. He opened his eyes, looking down at Leo with a gaze that held no room for retreat. "Bring the equipment. Bring the kid. Bring the battered van. I want all of it, Leo." Leo looked around the perfectly modified apartment. He looked at the man who had bought a clinic just to keep him from falling on a dirty floor. He thought of Sam drawing blueprints with a neon pink highlighter. The world was still heavy. His legs would never work again. The phantom pain would still wake him up in the middle of the night. But as Dominic's thumb gently traced the line of his jaw, Leo realized he didn't have to carry the gravity alone anymore. "Okay," Leo whispered, his gray eyes finally clear of the storm. "I'm in." Dominic smiled, leaning down to capture Leo's lips once more. And for the first time in his life, the ruthless CEO of Wright Medical Logistics felt his carefully ordered world perfectly, beautifully upended. If you love this story of resilience, defiance, and a romance built on structural integrity, rather than empty words, don't let the journey end here. The world might be broken, but stories like Dominic and Leo's prove we can rebuild it. One ramp, one contract, and one heartbeat at a time. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with fellow fans of grounded, emotional Omegaverse dramas and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next deeply human audio story. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment? See you in the next one.